Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zoltan Gyevai. I am Brussels correspondent of Free Europe. Our discussion is today about the European Union strategic agenda between 2024 and 2029. We have a panel consisted of 5 experts. The 5th is on his way. I hope that he has been already here before, so I hope that he is just coming.
Stefan, come.
He's coming, okay.
Oh, he is.
He's already here. Please, Stefan, join us. So, first of all, I would like to introduce our speakers. On my left, Mr. Janis Emmanouilidis, who is Director of Studies, European Policy Center in Brussels. Mr. Federico Steinberg is a Special Advisor to the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, Mr. Borrell. Monsieur Francois Heisbourg, Senior Advisor for Europe at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a Special Advisor at Recherche Stratégique France. And Mr. Stefan Schepers, who is Executive Director of the high-level groups on EU policy innovation. And at last but not least, Ivana Dragicevic, my colleague, journalist at number 1 TV Croatia. So just to give you the background, we are going to discuss the strategic agenda, of course, not only the content, but also how this strategic agenda should be implemented. As a starter, just to remind you that the European Council in June is to adopt 2 documents. One is the strategic agenda, and I understand that this document is in the making because Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, is consulting with all the leaders of the European Union. And there is also, which may be more interesting, more sexy, I would say even, a roadmap on the internal reforms. And of course, it would be very interesting to see this, how it relates to enlargement, etc. As a warming up question, I would like to ask our discussants, speakers, to answer one question. What do you think that is there any single big challenge for the European Union in the next 5 years? Or there are a set of challenges, and if this challenge, what it should be? I would like to ask you that please try to answer in a very short way, because we can then enter into discussion on this. So I'm going like this.
Well, first of all, I think there are around 3 or 4 main priorities, but you asked for the priority.
Yes.
And I think that the priority needs to be, for the upcoming 5 years, issues related to security and defense. Mm-hmm. And when I say that, that actually has a meaning in the sense that if we concentrate, and I said that I would add 2 more, but I concentrate on this one because you asked for 1. If we concentrate on security and defense, this would have implications, because it means that we actually, in terms of the investments we will be able to do, the political investment, but also the financial investment, we need to concentrate on this, make it possible to actually have a high-level ambition to this key strategic priority, which means that in other areas we'll be able to do less. So the question of trade-offs come up. So it sounds like a simple question you're posing, but I think it is a key question which we're still hiding from at the European level.
Okay, thank you. Please, Federico.
Thank you. I think that the key element is to decide on the trade-offs on the elements we put on the table. And Janis mentioned this right now, but also in the previous panels. I think we have, we academics like trilemmas. So I think we have a new trilemma on the table. We have security, hard and economic security also, so both aspects, and that's linked to competitiveness, industrial policy, etc. We have the energy transition, the green transition, and we have a budget, a hard budget constraint. We have new rules of the Stability and Growth Pact. That's good news compared to the previous situation, but as Professor Tsoukalis said in the previous panel as well, we need more money. And the problem we have is that we have to choose between those and understand the trade-offs. For example, if we are going to be importing electric vehicles from China, this is going to be good for the energy transition, but probably not good for economic security. And if we don't understand that the US doesn't seem to have a budget constraint, if you look at the Americans, they are projecting 6 or 7% deficit every year up until 2030, no problem. There might be a debt crisis, but it's very unlikely because of the role of the dollar. And China, on the other hand, also plays with different roles. So we have to see where to spend and the trade-offs.
Okay, thank you. The trade-offs is understand, Mr.
Yeah, four sentences. First sentence,
In the 1950s, the game, as Lord Ismay put it at the time, was keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Well, we can forget about the German part. The second sentence is, today, the US is getting out, the Russians are coming back in, the Chinese are coming up, and the Europeans are pretty much on their own. Third sentence, it gets worse. China and the US both are engaged in a return to mercantilism, and a mercantilism which is framed not only in economic terms, but is also part of their respective security agendas. And the last sentence is, in the real world, we have a war in Ukraine, and the United States, as part of its getting out, is being run by what is in effect a Biden-Trump duo, with Biden trying to de-escalate, self-deterring, while Trump makes sure that not a single weapon from the US reaches Ukraine. And the outcome of that, and I end that fourth sentence, is that Europe is already the prime mover on whatever happens as a result of Russia being in a position to win the war in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Please, Stefan.
Thank you. I think the next 5 years, we need to concentrate on correcting the transition failures of the previous 5. The approach to the Green Deal, however valid its final objective, could have been different and should become a different one, with more focus on investments in research and related innovation processes, and less focus on regulation. To achieve this different approach to transition, we need to start talking about something which is seldom discussed in Brussels, that is governance innovation. We still try to steer the European Union with the mechanisms of the 1950s, slightly adapted in the Lisbon Treaty. That was 20 years ago. You cannot build an electric car with the methods you used for a mechanical car. So we really need to review our governance mechanisms, and a lot of can be done within the treaties. And there's 2 priorities which stand out. The first one is to focus much more on systems thinking. The EU is a system of member states embedded in other economic systems globally. And secondly, a much greater focus on foresight, independent, multidisciplinary foresight. To conclude with just one figure, we have some very high-quality think tanks in Brussels. In Washington and in Beijing, the capacity of think tanks is 10 times more in budgets and in staff. Even if you add that some of the national think tanks partly work on European issues, the difference is still very large. So we need to move to more serious preparatory policy making, research and policy making, think tank work, and then we need to discuss how we can change our government system and make it much more effective to deal with the transitions which are going on in all these systems simultaneously, politically, geopolitically, economic, and not forget social, cultural.
Thank you.
Thank you. When you said you're going to ask this question at the beginning, I was like the best pupil in the class, so I wrote like 5 things that I see can be, I don't know, named as strategic challenges or risks in the framework of what Mr. Michel wrote should be this, main points of the next strategic agenda. So You both talked about trade-offs. I wrote it down. It's like trade-offs basically between efficiency and resilience. My field of work, mis and disinformation, as a big systemic risk for democracy as such. Cascading failures and external disruptions that we have and that we can expect anew. In general, for our population still, and after Recovery and Resilience Fund and all the new forms of financing, it can be unequal access and benefits for our citizens. And the one that basically affects us all, and it's not present in the discussion, it's algorithmic bias and basically allocative harms that come out of that. And to conclude, I think strategic challenge for us all is how to communicate that to our citizens in times of war, this is my field of work, and in times of crisis, and in times of this kind of systemic risks before us. Because when you talk about rule of law, and when you talk about democracy, you need to think, where are these kids from Arachova High School who can, they're 17, I spoke with them, and they can give us some new ideas for this new world that we may not think of. So I think that for new times and for new challenges, we need to include next generation on equal footing in our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We have heard very different, not different views, but different priorities, which are coming together, I believe. What I heard is, for me, maybe with one exception, is about the European Union in a situation, and we are talking about the situation where we are now, in rather reactive, following what we see in the world, and we try to react, we try to catch up with the United States, we try to catch up with China, with everybody. With the exception, perhaps, which Stefan said, that the innovation way, but it is rather about the governance, how we should organize ourselves. So my question is about it here is that shall we, as the situation is, accept that Europe will be the next year also rather a follower than a leader in many issues, in the issues which determine our presence now? I give the floor first of all to you, Janis.
Okay, I think there are two dimensions when answering that question. The first one is what is likely to be happen. So if I put my analytical hat on, and the second dimension is what we should be doing. What is likely is that we probably be rather still remaining in the position of followers. Because our strength has not been among the 27 member states, and I'm looking particularly at the member states, not on the EU institutions in terms of its supranational institutions, the Commission, the European Parliament, but rather at the member state level. At the member state level, I do not think that we have the level of ambition which would be required for Europe, the European Union, not to be what you call a follower. And analytically, I think that this will not improve in the months and years to come. The likelihood is that after the European Parliament elections, where we will see not only a strengthening of the voices of the right or radical right in the European Parliament, but also a strengthening of the radical right when it comes to European affairs at the national level, which I consider to be even more worrisome news from a European perspective. So the situation will not improve. We have a leadership deficit in Europe. Unfortunately, we no longer have a coalition of key member states who are pushing in the same direction. We all have in mind Paris and Berlin, but we these days also have to include, obviously, Warsaw. That is a silver line, that we have the new government and Donald Tusk in power in Poland. But we still have a leadership deficit and also huge differences between key capitals. And I could go on analytically describing of why chances are high that we will continue to muddle through. And someone who muddles through in a situation which is as volatile and uncertain as the one we are experiencing will not become a leader, but actually will have to passively, reactively follow. Now, is this the right thing to do? Obviously not. I think if you follow the discussion we have here, if you follow the discussion we had in other panels also yesterday, it is clear that we are in transition, that the transition we're witnessing is massive, and that Europe is confronted with challenges which are of a fundamental nature which it needs to respond to. So in many ways, there is no alternative to being more proactive. Because if we're not more proactive, we will find ourselves, and I do not know for whatever reason, for whatever situation, in a situation in future where potentially what we have done over the past 10, 15 years, which has been reactive crisis management. We've always dealt with the crises as they came. We were able to deal with them. We actually developed a response which many of us did not think would be possible. So we have this crisis logic. Whenever they happen, we will respond. I think at the current state, given the current challenges we're having, this is naive, it's dangerous, and by the way, also with respect to future generations, it's highly irresponsible because we're leaving Europe behind, which is not adequate in responding to the new situation. And I think there is an increasing awareness for that, also among political leaders.
Yes.
But actually, awareness and Sunday speeches and reflections are not reflected in Monday's realities.
Okay.
And that's why, by the way, it's good that we have
Janis.
an exchange
Thank you.
about the strategic agenda.
I need to go further a little because we don't have time, but thank you very much for your ideas. About the situation still, and I'm turning to Francois, Heisbourg. You remember, in 2019, we had this 5 years compass strategy. We completely missed the point because we couldn't foresee, of course, the COVID. We couldn't foresee the war. We could, by the way, foresee the war in Ukraine, by the way, since on the experiences of 2014, perhaps we could, but we missed the point. And if you see, maybe we are now in a better position to predict what we can expect in the next 5 years. At least two aspects I would like to raise. One is, you can hear the rhetoric is a little bit changing in Europe. More and more leaders, many leaders are starting to speak about the need to prepare for a war. You know, Donald Tusk said we are in a pre-war period. Ma'am, your boss, Mr. Borrell, said something similar. So we hear this rhetoric, which it's quite interesting one, and also I believe that maybe it helps us to come out from the comfort zone. The second is what everybody takes almost for granted, that we will face a new Trump 2.0, a new Trump period, which I believe that maybe can help Europe to project something, to plan something. How do you see the situation, Francois, from this point of view?
First of all, I'm not going to get into the guessing what the result of the American elections is going to be in the next 5-6 months game. It's a losing game, and it's not very useful to think 5 years ahead with that sort of approach. What we do see in the United States is that there is a change in the geostrategic situation, which is the US is focusing on Indo-Pacific. This is the big, deep trend, that the relationship with Europe is going to be much more transactional. Whoever wins the election, it's going to be much quicker and worse with Trump, but it's not going to be that different with Biden, which is why I was urging already earlier on that we should think about Biden and Trump in tandem, because we have the combination of the policies of both actually at work today in the case of Ukraine. You don't have to wait until the result of the election. Now, to answer your question, there are two dimensions. First dimension is very simple to describe, difficult to handle, and that is, yes, we have a big problem if Russia wins the war in Ukraine, and if the US has essentially signaled that it's no longer going to sustain a US-centric security system in Europe, then what do we do? And we are forced into a reactive mode, by the way, because whenever the French, for example, suggested that maybe, just maybe, we should think about strategic autonomy, every single member state sort of told the French, shut up, don't talk about it, you're going to scare the Americans away. Well, so much for proaction. So we are condemned to reaction, and as I say, it's very simple to describe, it's difficult to see what to do about it, increasing defense spending, having the Commission heavily involved in defense industrial affairs and so on. We know what some of the recipes are. The much more complex part is how to handle the Chinese-American nexus, which is both economic and security in nature, and where Europe is essentially being faced not with two countries which are tearing each other apart and where somehow the Europeans would pull the chestnuts from the fire. No, we are being pummeled by the convergent pressure of those two countries. Somebody was talking about electric vehicles earlier on. Now, isn't that a great idea? We only have to deal with 1.6 trillion in subsidies announced in China for so-called new developing forces, $1.6 trillion, not yuan, I hasten to add. And in the case of the US, we have to deal with the IRA, the CHIPS Act, and so on. And all of this made even worse by the fact that in both capitals, this is seen as part and parcel of a security competition. And Europe, as I say, is actually entirely on its own, much weaker than any of these two protagonists taken individually, and obviously even weaker if you take the two together. And how you deal with that when there is, on top of everything else, I'm not going to get into we have to put more money into think tanks mode, even though I come from think tanks. That's not going to do anything to solve the problem, I'm afraid. The fact is that we have no strategy generation governance in Europe today. We have parcels of it, bits of it. NATO does a bit, actually not that much when you look at Ukraine, which is done essentially in a multi-bilateral mode. And national capitals, of course, but here the inputs can be highly contradictory, as between France and Germany. And the European Council doesn't really deal with that either. So the China-US nexus, once again, for me, that's the really, really hard one in conceptual terms. The defense, dealing with the Russia issue, as I say, it's going to be very difficult. Spending 3% of GDP, as the Greeks already do, by the way, is something which we're all going to have to do. It's very difficult, but it's very simple. I mean, it's not difficult to describe.
We are coming back to
sorry.
this question.
I've been going on too long.
Yes, but we are talking interestingly because it's basically about geopolitics and geopolitical challenges, which are now prevailing, it seems to be. So it's about the hardware Europe you should dispose. But at the same time, there are different areas where we also compete with the Americans and the Chinese. Competitiveness, the climate issue, of course, energy, and of course what we call this autonomous Europe, everything. How we can combine these many things at the same time? Europe was not so bad in the last 5 years, I think, so that to face different multiple perm crises, as you said. But can we really bring out of this the best if we are under such a huge pressure, for example, on the defense side? And later we are talking about the financial part, because I believe that what we are talking now, it needs an absolute big change when it comes to the financing of the European Union policies as well. Please, Federico.
Yes, well, absolutely agree with what's been said, in particular the position of the EU in the US-China rivalry. I'm based in the US now, so everything that has been said about think tanks in the US is completely correct in terms of size. But more importantly, the US has structurally changed its position in terms of the defense of the so-called liberal world order. It's adopting a completely neo-mercantilist strategy. We see that in the ideas, Jake Sullivan talking about the new architecture, but then that translates into policies, and then it's going to translate into what you see in the data, which is not yet that about fragmentation of the global economy. And in a way, the US, and this goes, I agree, it was a case with Trump. With Biden, it's been similar. The dialogue is much better, but the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, is completely empty as a form of dialogue. And then the US is pushing the EU to align completely with the US vis-a-vis China. And we are trying to resist. It's not in our interest, but we are, neo-imperialism and neo-mercantilism are back to the world, and the EU was basically about forgetting about those. This is our big problem, right? So very briefly, we understand now that in this situation, we are going to need federal spending for research on tech and on green to be able to match somehow the IRA or Chinese subsidies. Not necessarily a subsidies war, but also to defend the internal market, which is a big thing. And then there's an opportunity probably, and if we look at history, probably the US history is a good lesson. You know, federal spending appears mostly because they had external threats and needs to do American public good. We need European public good. And the next generation EU experience is a nice blueprint to work on. We've written a lot in Bruegel and other places about this. And I think we have to go that way in terms of financing European public goods. And I can go deeper later into this.
Okay, thank you. I'm turning now to Stefan. If you look at the latest one, the last strategic agenda, the climate issue was very much high on the agenda 5 years ago. And if you see, the new buzzword is becoming the competitiveness, which I remind you that next week the European Council will come together, and I have seen the draft conclusions, and maybe it's not, for the time being, it's Charles Michel's intention to launch a kind of European competitiveness deal, whatever it means, by the way. So, Stefan, I would like to ask you that, do you think so that now in the new situation, which partially caused by the war, the climate issue is on the back seat, or at least in the rhetorics, or even in the content as well, and now we have to brace ourselves for something else, which is called competitiveness, as I told, whatever it means, because it can mean many, many things. Do you think so that, do you see this threat, this danger, that now the European Union is changing the priorities, and the priority is not anymore the climate change or something like that?
Well, the climate issue and competitiveness are linked, because we've had 5 years Green Deal for better and worse, and nearly all European industries and agriculture are orienting their business plans, their investment plans towards these goals. There's no way back. What we have to look at is the cost picture. And competitiveness is not a football game or a box match. Competitiveness is based, in our view, on research capacities, which help to bring new products for a green economy, new services, and which reduce the cost of production. We have a structural high energy cost in Europe. If we could focus a lot of research on reducing energy consumption, energy saving, that would have a competitive advantage, as well as a green positive effect. So the two are intrinsically linked. What I was saying earlier is, because we don't think enough in system terms, we don't connect enough. We are too fragmented in our approaches. We have in Europe very high research capacities, and we spend almost as much money as the US, if you add it all up. But if you look at it in a fragmented way, and if you steer these in a fragmented way, a fragmentation between EU member states, among member states, and between the public and the private research investment, then we lose effectiveness. And this is why I think to achieve the various goals we are confronted with, the security issue is a real one. The climate, we cannot go back on it. It's part of our competitiveness. It's not antagonistic. We have to look at different ways of managing the EU system, and that consists of EU and member states. I agree with Janis, it will be very difficult because of the elections coming, won't make it easier. But we have to start a discussion how we achieve what we want to achieve. And that discussion has not taken place since in the last 20 years. Marginally, yes, but not fundamentally. And this
Why not?
There are a variety of reasons. The EU has had many successes. I mean, we were very successful with the common market, the single market, economic monetary union, and success in my view, breeds complacency. So the governance issue, the management issue, wasn't high enough on the agenda. After Lisbon, it wasn't on the agenda at all. And this means we need concrete measures. We, in the groups which I steer, we are going to propose, for example, that amendments of the European Parliament need in future an impact assessment. It's not a democratic right of parliamentarians to make whatever amendment if there's no serious assessment of the economic, social impact. I know it won't fly, but a discussion about how we manage Europe is an important. It doesn't need treaty change. A lot can be done within the treaty. If you move to different mechanisms, this is a great weakness which we have, I think. We did some work with Janis's EPC on that, but it's a start. We haven't yet the solution, because the governance problem itself, how do you deal with a system, to conclude, how you transform a system which was set up in a legalistic, technocratic way to manage market integration, how do you change that to manage strategic agility in a rapidly changing world? No one has the answer, but we need the discussion.
Okay, thank you. I will come back to this, but before going to the financial part of this issue, you mentioned the communication, because I think so this is the part maybe is most neglected in Europe for the time being. We had a European conference, we invited the people to contribute, and we completely forgot what they were asking for. Nobody cares too much about it. At the same time, we are suffering every day the Russian propaganda through our sometimes public media. The country I know the best is, for example, a good example for this. Ivana, what we should do more, what we can do more in order to involve the people in this everyday problems and the strategic decisions.
Mr. Hinas is not here. No, he said that it would be good that Taylor Swift, who launches her European tour on 9th of May in Paris, should invite young Europeans, for example, to go and vote. I can give you a list. I talked to young Greeks now of 6 bands and trap artists, I don't know, Tremus Light, Bloody Hawk, and people we have in Europe, in all nation states, because we are a construct of that kind, that European Council functions like that, that we need to have this regional, let's say, differences that make Europe, Europe. So I think strategic communication in times of strategic threats, in times of war, and that European leaders are designing strategic agenda in times of war, and that basically defense as a new thing in our equation wasn't mentioned substantially today, is something that we really need to think of. We have now DSA, but we have, for example, Mr. Musk, who is completely ideological in the United States. We have this issue of TikTok. We had, a couple of weeks ago, this discovery of French intelligence that basically Russians are still opening up new news outlets on the internet that are, I don't know which word to use, but they are making cognitive issues within our population. And I think if we miss this algorithmic world we live in, these loopholes that are being created, these inequalities that are detaching people from democratic processes in Europe, and to leave it out of the strategic thinking in our continent during the time of Commission which invented portfolio of European values of demography, democracy, and future of Europe. And basically what you said, there are results, but they weren't communicated well. Mm-hmm. So I think this is something that we can tell. We can tell a story of Europe not to be boring, as the campaign for European elections is. We can make people think or make democracy great again. I don't know how to say it. Because within our societies, we have people what Stefan was saying, we need new ideas, basically, and we need to invite new people in, because with old people, you cannot get new ideas. So that is maybe my 5 cents, because we don't have much time to elaborate. But communication in that regard, telling the story, because Putin announced war on values. So how do you tell the story of our values if you have the youngest parts of Europe, which are urban parts of Belgium and France, where kids are being still beaten and excluded for any process? How do you change education in times of technical acceleration of everything that's going on? And this is traditional institution that we have, education, et cetera, et cetera. Yes. So a lot of things to spill out, but I think, you know, it needs to be out there, because it's also security issue, but it's democracy issue.
Yes, thank you. So it leads to me to the next question, which is already related to the other issue of the European Council next months, when it comes to the internal reform roadmap as well. What we were talking about, that I understand that we need a huge change, huge shift in the European Union. Perhaps really a change which was not in the last 20, 30 years, in order to be able to cater all the challenges we are facing. And of course, one issue is somebody looking at the Hungarian and the European budget, 1% of the GDP. So what we can do, what we should do, how can we change? We know the realities are not very much in favor that member states would now opt for a double the budget, but even doubling the budget would be not enough for me, at least looking at this problem. So what we could, and it is innovation comes into cards. How can we innovate? Because I'm just telling you one issue. Of course, one of the innovation is that issuing common debt, which looks like a kind of magical solution. But if you look at how we are now, the European Union has now more than, if I'm not mistaken, 400 milliard euros debt already. Because this debt should be paid by somebody, and normally member states. So for me, maybe it's not a magic solution always trying to issuing common debt. You have to recourse to some other issues. What can you say about this? What we need in order to financially match these challenges we are facing? And I'm now going, each of you, I'm asking you about this, because it's an important issue.
Well, first of all, when we look into the question of internal EU reform, we look in two basic dimensions. One is policy reform, and the other one is governance reform. Part of the governance and policy reform, they are both linked to the budget. When it comes to internal reform, the appetite to reform the European Union among member states and at the top level about heads of state and government is extremely low. But going to the budget, because I think this is key. And sorry for simplifying, but if we would agree in the EU on what the top priorities are, my list would be, I mentioned first, defense security, second would be climate, and third would be economic security. If you identify, now others might disagree, but if you identify what the top priorities are, you need to then invest into these top priorities. That requires money. Now, the experience we've had, there was a midterm review of the EU budget which happened over the course of the past months. The experience was that we were fighting for 20-30 billion, by the way, in the context of the Ukraine narrative, so there was a bigger narrative of why we need more spending. We were fighting, the Commission had made a proposal, at the end we came out at some additions to EU spending, but minor. So if this is the logic, and this is something which happened over the past months, it's not something which happened a long time ago, so in the context of the current situation, but this is an experience we have which shows that the readiness to actually invest much more is extremely low. And this is something which Gudi was already mentioning, we need to think of the next generation EU model. Mario Draghi will come forward with proposals which will invoke the necessity to have much higher spending. We're talking about hundreds of millions of more higher spending at the European level, which will require common joint borrowing. Now go with that proposal to Berlin, to The Hague, to Vienna, and the answer you will get, not only, the answer you will get there is, forget it. The Finnish think differently now than they did in the past, so that's interesting. But the lesson from the next generation EU was that you need to put pressure on these key players to get the ball moving. Angela Merkel, in 2020, in the context of the COVID crisis, saw that it was necessary to put something in place at the European level, because if it's not being put in place, the argument of destroying the single market would become stronger. And that was a fear, because the Germans have a strong interest in the common market. So there was a political incentive that led to the Franco-German agreement, and then to an agreement at the EU level, which then led eventually to the next generation EU. There's a lesson to be learned. You need to put strong arguments on those who oppose common borrowing at a massive scale, which is necessary to actually put the means necessary to implement the priorities which you've agreed to. You need to put pressure on these players. That is the lesson we have from the past. So all those who want that need to think constructively how they collectively can put pressure on those who obstruct it and convince the others that it's the right thing to do.
Okay.
That's extremely difficult, but actually this is the lesson we have learned, and if we're serious about priorities and if we put the money where our mouth is, that's what we have to do politically.
Federico. Yes.
I completely agree, and I would add that in the Netherlands also, I think the mindset has changed slightly. And in Germany, it depends on the day, but it's important. Basically and conceptually, we can have more direct contributions to the budget, more European own resources, but talking seriously, and it's not the CBAM or the plastic tax, something more, maybe the transfer of VAT, that's probably the most practical one. And third, issuing debt. And we probably need the three. It's absurd that there's no debt issuance on a regular basis if we want to be a geopolitical actor. That doesn't make any sense. But probably, since these things are complicated, as Janis mentioned, the way it would be easier is to go for some sort of a permanent fiscal capacity, smaller, perhaps like Next Generation, perhaps off budget, until we see if this can move forward. And start. One thing about the EU is once you start doing stuff, normally you continue doing it. So the experience, some countries consider this a one-off. Of course, Next Gen EU in Spain, in Italy, in Greece have to go very well. It's going slower than projected, but it's reasonable. The stick and carrots dynamic of reforms for funding has worked, I think. And therefore, that's the way to go. But we need to be careful and, of course, look at member state resistance, particularly in these hawkish countries.
Okay, Francois?
Yeah, three priorities. First one is, as was mentioned earlier on, defense. That doesn't require a lot of EU money. It requires more money, that's clear. For me, the logic of the situation is, in the absence of a significant US presence, we'll have to move to 3% of GDP. 3% of GDP is 1% more than the average today. 1% is not huge. Most of that is at the national level. 3 countries, Poland, Estonia, and Greece, already do it. The Brits, who are not in the EU, have just announced that the Labour government, when it comes in, would actually aim initially for 2.5. And within the current plans for EU spending, this, I think, can be accommodated pretty much in the form which has been practiced de facto with the initiatives taken within the Commission.
Sorry for interrupting you.
Second priority.
Okay.
We have to find a way to integrate policy making in the security, economic, ecological arena, to treat them in an integrated fashion, the way the Chinese do and the way the Americans do. We do not do that. Stovepiping is what is currently being considered. And last thing, do not do stupid stuff. We don't need to change the treaties. We don't need a defense minister within the Commission.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Stefan.
The budget, of course, is key.
We
need to look at the cost of the transition, which have been grossly underestimated. We have spent until now 2.6% of GDP on the transition, and we should spend over 5 to 6%, according to the latest studies done. Now, exactly what you say, Francois, this doesn't have to go against climate or against security. If we do some integrated thinking, and the Americans have a very good system for that, is the DARPA system of the Pentagon. We don't have that. We operate in a fragmented way.
Thank you. Sorry, because it is almost over. Ivana, last word.
Yeah.
Last sentence, please. Thank you.
And with open hearts, give your hands to your friends. First row, my new friend, advisor to President of Zambia, which is in coalition of democracies of the world. We need to have frank and open relationship with our southern neighbors and friends in Africa, because together we can do some things for our strategic future. Without them, we are screwed concerning our future of demography, resources, you name it, but on new equal footings for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Our time is unfortunately over. Thank you for this interesting discussion, which was still on the surface. We could continue it for hours. And thank you for your attention. Please.